The dog found it first. He was a German shepherd named Scout, all duty and bone, and his duty that afternoon was to stay at his mistress's heel as she walked the fence line. But he had stopped. Anna saw him standing 50 yards ahead, his body locked and pointed not at a rabbit or a coyote, but at the rock face itself, a sheer wall of granite that marked the western edge of her property. His nose was pressed to a line of shadow, a vertical seam in the stone no wider than a man's shoulders. He did not bark. He did not whine. He simply stood, a statue of conviction, his tail a low, straight rudder of certainty. Anna continued her walk, her boots scuffing dust from the hard-packed earth. The posts needed checking. The wire, tightening. It was a job Thomas had done every Tuesday, and now it was a job she did, one of 1,000 small routines that held her life together in the 2 years since he was gone. The sun was hot on her neck, the air thin and dry. Everything in this country was earned. Water from the well, warmth from the stove, a moment's peace from the ceaseless wind that scoured the plains. She reached the dog and put a hand on his head. His muscles were rigid. "What is it, boy?" she murmured. He nudged his nose deeper into the crack. A puff of air, cool and damp, breathed out against her hand. It was a startling sensation in the baked heat of the afternoon, a whisper of another season. Anna knelt, her knees complaining on the stony ground. She had walked this line more times than she could count. She knew this wall of rock, its familiar stains of iron and lichen, the way the light caught it at dawn. She had never noticed the fissure. It was hidden in a slight recess, masked by a projection of stone. It looked like nothing. Just another shadow. But Scout was insistent, and the air that trickled from it felt like a lie against the day. She pressed her face closer, inhaling. It smelled of deep earth, of wet stone and a clean, profound stillness. It was the smell of a cellar, but there was no cellar here, miles from any settlement, on a patch of land that offered nothing but horizons and hard work. Scout looked up at her, his amber eyes asking a question she did not understand. He then pushed his head and shoulders into the opening, a motion of such confidence that it startled her. He was not exploring, he was entering. She grabbed the thick ruff of his neck and pulled him back, his claws scraping for purchase. "No," she said, her voice firm. He sat, obedient but vibrating with an unmet purpose. Anna stood up, brushing the dust from her skirt. She looked from the crack in the wall to the vast, empty sky, then back. It was nothing. A trick of the air. A shallow cave where a bit of night had been trapped. But the dog knew otherwise. And the cool, damp breath on her skin felt like a promise. She left the fence line unfinished. The certainty of the dog had unsettled the rhythm of her day. Back in the small sod house, the air was warm and smelled of dried herbs and soap. Everything had its place. The 2 tin plates on the shelf, the worn Bible on the small table, the neatly folded quilt on the bed. It was a life stripped down to its essentials, and she had believed she knew every one of them. The crack in the rock was not on the list. That evening, as the sun bled out across the prairie, she made her decision. It was not a choice born of adventure, but of a deep and abiding pragmatism that Thomas had instilled in her. He had been a man who believed in looking at things directly. "Never let a question fester, Anna," he would say, his hands busy mending a harness or sharpening a blade. "It'll turn sour." She took the lantern from its hook by the door. She cleaned the soot from its interior and trimmed the wick with a pair of small scissors. She filled its reservoir with oil, her movement steady and economical. Then she went to the chest at the foot of her bed and took out a length of rope, 50 feet of it, coiled as tightly as a sleeping snake. She had not touched it since the day Thomas had used it to lower the last stone into the well. She tested its strength, pulling a section taut between her hands, feeling the familiar bite of the fibers. She tucked a small canvas pouch into her pocket, containing a piece of bread and a small flask of water. She was not a fanciful woman. She did not expect a hidden world. She expected a cramped space, a quick end, and the satisfaction of a question answered. When she stepped outside, the stars were emerging in the deep purple sky. Scout was waiting by the door, as if he had known all along. He did not bound ahead but walked beside her, a silent partner in the quiet expedition. The air had cooled, but the faint breeze that came from the rock was still noticeably colder, a current in the still ocean of the night. At the fissure, she lit the lantern. The flame sputtered, then grew steady, casting a small, brave circle of yellow light against the immense dark. She tied one end of the rope around her waist and the other to a sturdy, deep-rooted juniper that grew near the opening. She looked at Scout. "Stay," she commanded. He whined, a low note of protest. "Stay," she repeated, and this time he lay down, his head on his paws, his eyes fixed on the light she carried. She turned, took a breath, and slid her body into the mountain. The passage was tighter than she had imagined. The rock was cold and unforgiving against her shoulders and hips. She had to exhale to gain an inch, her ribs compressing as she shuffled sideways, the lantern held out in front of her. The flame threw dancing, distorted shadows that made the walls seem to move. Her own breathing was loud in the enclosed space, a ragged counterpoint to the scraping of her boots on the stone floor. Scout began to bark outside, a frantic, tearing sound that echoed unnervingly in the passage. The sound was her only connection to the world she had left, and with every foot she gained, it grew fainter. The passage was not straight, it curved gently, so that after 20 feet, the pale rectangle of the entrance was gone. She was alone in the dark, save for her small, flickering light. A moment of panic, sharp and cold as the rock, seized her. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She was a fool. A widow, alone, chasing a dog's whim into the belly of the earth. She could get stuck. The lamp could fail. No one would find her. Thomas's face appeared in her mind, his expression calm and steady. 1 foot, then the next, he would have said. "That's all there is to it." She took a breath, forcing the air deep into her lungs. The panic subsided, leaving a residue of resolve. She was not a fool. She was a woman who finished what she started. She continued on, her movements more deliberate now. The air grew cooler, damper. She could hear a faint, rhythmic dripping somewhere in the darkness ahead. 30 feet. 35. The passage began to widen. She could stand straighter, could turn her shoulders without scraping stone. And then, at what she guessed was 40 feet, the walls simply fell away. She took a step forward and her boot met open air. She stopped, holding the lantern high. The light touched nothing. It was swallowed by an immense, silent blackness. She lowered the lantern. The floor of the passage ended on a wide ledge. Below, the darkness was absolute. She knelt, holding the light over the edge. It illuminated a vast, still surface of water, so clear and motionless it looked like polished obsidian. The light did not penetrate its depths. It simply lay on the surface, a perfect, trembling circle of gold. She raised the lantern again, sweeping it in a wide arc. The beam caught points of light on the cavern walls, constellations of pale green and blue minerals that glittered softly, returning her lamplight with a cool fire of their own. The cavern was immense, a cathedral of stone. The ceiling was lost in the darkness above, but she could sense the scale of it, the sheer volume of the space. From somewhere in that high darkness came the slow, measured drip of water, each drop landing in the pool below with a soft, resonant chime that hung in the still air. It was a world hidden from the sun, a place of perfect silence and profound peace. Scout's barking was gone. The wind was gone. The heat, the dust, the endless horizon, all of it had vanished. There was only the quiet drip of water, the soft glow of the walls, and the deep, abiding stillness of the earth. She did not move for a long time. The wonder of the place held her captive. It was not the kind of beauty she knew, the stark, hard beauty of the plains or the violent glory of a thunderstorm. This was a quiet, secret beauty, something ancient and undisturbed. She sat on the ledge, her legs dangling over the dark water, and simply watched the light from her lantern play against the mineral-flecked walls. The air was cool and clean, carrying no scent but that of wet stone. After a while, her practical nature reasserted itself. Wonder was a luxury, assessment was a tool. She began to take the measure of the place, not with a surveyor's chain, but with the practiced eye of a homesteader. The ledge she was on was about 10 feet wide and ran for perhaps 30 feet along one side of the cavern. The pool of water seemed to fill the rest of the space. She picked up a small, loose stone from the ledge and tossed it into the center of the pool. It vanished without a sound, and the ripples that spread from its entry were slow and heavy, speaking of great depth. This was not a cistern. This was a lake. She untied the rope from her waist and, holding one end, lowered the other into the water near the edge. It sank straight down. She let out more and more, until the full 50 feet were submerged and she still had not felt the bottom. She pulled the wet rope back up, her hands cold from the water. It was fresh. Clean. She touched a damp finger to her lips. There was no hint of alkali or salt. It was sweet water. In a land where water was life, where her own well was 80 feet deep and sometimes grudging, this was a discovery beyond price. She turned her attention to the walls. She ran her hand over the nearest surface. The stone was smooth, almost polished, and cool to the touch. The glowing flecks were embedded in the rock itself, not a surface growth. They seemed to catch the light and hold it, releasing it slowly, so that even when she moved the lantern away, a faint luminescence remained for a moment, like an afterimage. She walked the length of the ledge, her boots making soft sounds in the immense silence. The cavern was roughly circular, she guessed, maybe 200 feet across. The dripping from the ceiling was consistent, a slow but steady source of replenishment for the pool. This place was not static. It was alive, a hidden circulatory system within the mountain. She thought of her small garden, of the barrels she filled at the well, the endless work of carrying buckets to the thirsty rows of beans and corn. She thought of the long, dry spell last summer that had almost broken them, the way the earth had cracked and the sky had remained a pale, merciless blue for weeks. Here was an answer. A secret reservoir, protected from the sun, immune to the whims of the weather. It was a fortress of solitude and a wellspring of life. The thought was so large it was difficult to contain. She sat down again, her back against the cool rock, and took out the piece of bread from her pouch. As she ate, the reality of it began to settle in her. This place could change everything. It could mean the difference between surviving and thriving. It was a gift from the earth, a secret she and her dog now shared. A deep sense of peace, and something akin to ownership, began to settle over her. The next day, she began the work. It was a slow, arduous process, governed by the narrowness of the passage. She could not bring a wheelbarrow or a cart. Everything had to be carried. She started with the things she would need to make the ledge more habitable. A small stool, a crate to serve as a table, a few extra blankets folded and tied with twine. Each trip was a struggle, a careful negotiation with the unyielding stone. She would push the object ahead of her, then squeeze her own body through, her muscles aching with the effort. Scout would watch from the entrance, whining with a helpless anxiety until she re-emerged into the daylight. Once the basic comforts were in place, she began the real labor, moving water. She had 2 sturdy buckets, and she devised a system. She would carry the empty buckets into the cavern, fill them from the deep, still pool, and then haul them, heavy and sloshing, back through the tight passage. The first trip took her nearly an hour. The water was heavy, and balancing the buckets while shuffling sideways was a formidable challenge. She spilled nearly a quarter of the water on the first attempt, soaking her skirt and boots. But she learned. She learned to move with a slow, rhythmic grace, to anticipate the curves of the passage, to keep her body low and stable. Over weeks, the work shaped her. Her arms and back grew stronger. A new kind of endurance settled into her, born of this secret task. She created a small, hidden garden in a sheltered hollow not far from the fissure, a place invisible from the track that ran along the far side of her property. Here, she planted new seeds, tomatoes, squash, and even a few melon vines. She watered them not with the alkaline water from the well, but with the sweet, clear water from the hidden lake. The effect was astonishing. The plants grew with a vigor she had never seen before. Their leaves were a deep, healthy green, their fruits heavy and full of flavor. The cavern became her sanctuary. In the heat of the day, when the sun beat down on her small house and the air outside shimmered, she would retreat to the cool, silent darkness. She would sit on her stool, the lantern casting a low light, and mend her clothes or simply listen to the slow, steady drip of water. It was a place outside of time, a refuge from the harsh realities of her life. Winter came, burying the plains in a deep layer of snow. The wind howled, rattling the frame of her house. But in the cavern, the temperature remained constant, a cool, unwavering 55 degrees. The water did not freeze. The air did not stir. She began to store her preserves there, the jars of beans and tomatoes lining a section of the ledge, safe from the freezing and thawing of her root cellar. The cavern was no longer just a discovery, it was a part of her home, an extension of her life. It was her great and singular secret, a source of stability in a world that offered very little. She felt a quiet, fierce pride in it, in the work she had done, in the life she was building for herself, bucket by bucket, in the heart of the mountain. Her neighbor was a man named Sterling. He was a rancher whose property bordered hers to the east, a man who had lived in this country for 30 years and believed he understood its every mood and rhythm. He was not an unkind man, but his face was set in permanent lines of appraisal, as if he were constantly judging the worth of the land, the sky, the people he met. He rode a big roan horse and sat tall in the saddle, his authority rooted in his long and hard-won knowledge of the territory. He began to notice things in the late spring. He would ride the boundary line, a habit of his, and his gaze would drift over to Anna's small homestead. Her garden, which should have been struggling in the dry spell that had settled over the region, was conspicuously green. The leaves on her squash plants were broad and dark, not curled and dusty like his own. Later, in the summer, he saw that her water barrels, which stood by the corner of her sod house, were always full. He knew her well was deep and its water brackish. He knew the effort it took to draw it. There was a discrepancy there, a small tear in the fabric of how things ought to be. It was an imbalance he could not account for, and it bothered him in a way he could not name. One afternoon, he rode over, ostensibly to ask about a stray calf. Anna was in her yard, hanging laundry on a line. Scout stood near her, watching Sterling's approach with a low, quiet stillness. "Afternoon, Mrs. Miller," he said, reining in his horse. "Afternoon, Mr. Sterling." She did not stop her work, her hands moving with a fluid economy from the basket to the line. "Your garden's looking healthy," he said. It was not a compliment. It was a question. "The soil is good in that spot," she replied, her voice even. "Funny." Never seemed so before. He let the silence stretch. He looked at the full water barrels, then back at her. "Well's holding up." "It provides," she said. It was the truth, but not the whole truth. She met his gaze directly, her expression unreadable. There was a composure about her that he found unsettling. A widow, alone, should have been more fragile, more dependent on the charity of the seasons. But she seemed to possess a resource he could not see, a quiet confidence that did not fit her circumstances. He was a man who understood the world through scarcity. The land gave, but it always took more. You survived by knowing its limits, by respecting its stinginess. Anna's small plot of land, with its improbable abundance, suggested that the rules had been broken. It made him feel as if he were standing on shifting ground. He touched the brim of his hat. "Well, you see that calf, you let me know or I will," she said. He turned his horse and rode away, but he felt her eyes on his back. The question had been asked, and her answer had only created more. He would be watching. His watchfulness became a quiet pressure on the edges of her life. Sterling began to ride his fence line more frequently, his presence a silent weight on the horizon. She would see him paused on the ridgeline, a distant, still figure looking down toward her property. He was not threatening, not in any overt way. But his scrutiny was a constant reminder that her secret was a fragile thing. She became more careful. She started doing her watering in the dim light of dawn or the deepening twilight of evening, when she was less likely to be seen. She altered her path to the fissure, taking a longer, more circuitous route through a stand of junipers. The work, which had been a source of quiet pride, was now tinged with the anxiety of being discovered. The cavern, once a place of perfect peace, now felt like a liability. The fear was not for her safety. Sterling was not a violent man. The fear was of loss. The secret of the cavern was hers alone. It was a world she had found and cultivated through her own labor. To have it known, to have it become a subject of gossip or, worse, a common resource, felt like a violation. It was the only thing in her life that was truly and completely hers. One day, he almost caught her. She was emerging from the passage, her clothes damp, her hair clinging to her forehead. She stepped out into the bright afternoon light, blinking, and saw him. He was on his horse less than 100 yards away, his back to her, looking down at the creek bed in the gully below. Her heart leaped into her throat. Scout, who had been waiting for her, let out a single, sharp bark. Sterling turned in the saddle. Anna froze, pressing herself back against the rock face, praying the shadows would hold her. He scanned the area, his eyes passing over the jumble of rock where she stood. He had seen nothing, but he had heard the dog. He nudged his horse forward, his gaze narrowed, searching. For a long minute, he sat there, his horse shifting impatiently. Anna held her breath. The sun was hot on the exposed skin of her face. Finally, he seemed to decide it was nothing, a coyote perhaps, and turned his horse, riding on. Anna waited until he was a distant speck before she sagged against the rock, her legs weak with relief. The close call changed something in her. The quiet anxiety sharpened into a low, constant dread. She began to feel like a trespasser on her own land. Sterling's suspicion was a lock, and she knew, with a grim certainty, that he would keep turning the key until he found the door it opened. The confrontation came on a hot, still day in August. The air was thick with the smell of dust and dry grass. Anna was returning from the cavern, carrying one of her empty buckets. She had decided to risk a trip in the middle of the day, hoping the heat would keep Sterling to the shade of his own porch. As she stepped out of the fisher's shadow, she saw him. He was not on his horse. He was on foot, standing 20 feet away, his arms crossed over his chest. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the crack in the rock. Scout stood between them, not growling, but planted, a solid, immovable fact. Sterling's face was grim, his eyes narrowed with a kind of frustrated triumph. He had found it. He had followed the dog, or perhaps he had simply followed his own unshakable intuition. He looked from the crack to her, then to the bucket in her hand. "There's no water up here," he said. His voice was flat, an accusation. "The creek's been dry for a month." "Your well is half a mile in that direction," Anna's mind raced. She could lie, deny it, call him a trespasser and order him off her land. She could see the path of anger and denial, and she knew it would lead nowhere. It would only harden his suspicion into a dangerous certainty. He would come back, perhaps with other men. The secret would be torn from her. She looked at his face, at the hard lines of conviction etched there. He was not a man who could be swayed by denial. He was a man who believed in evidence, in the solid testimony of the earth. And she remembered Thomas, his quiet voice speaking of his time as a surveyor's assistant. "The land doesn't argue, Anna. It just is. If you want to prove a thing, you don't shout. You measure it. You draw the map." In that moment, she knew what she had to do. It was a risk, a profound one, but it was a risk taken from a position of strength, not fear. She would not be a victim of his discovery. She would be the author of its revelation. She set the bucket down. "Wait here," she said, her voice calm. She turned and walked away from him, back toward her house, leaving him alone with the dog and the silent crack in the mountain. She returned 10 minutes later. Sterling had not moved. He watched as she approached, his expression a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. She was carrying not a weapon, but a large, rolled piece of canvas. She stopped in front of him and, without a word, unrolled it on the dusty ground. It was a map. It was not a professional surveyor's chart, but it was drawn with a careful, steady hand. Using charcoal from her stove and berry juice for color, she had rendered the hidden world. there was the entrance, marked with a small cross. The 40-foot passage, drawn to scale, with its gentle curve noted. And then the cavern itself, a large, nearly perfect circle. The ledge was clearly marked, its dimensions written in neat figures. Ledge, 32 feet long, 11 feet wide. The great pool of water was shaded in blue, with a note at its edge, water depth unknown. Greater than 50 feet. She had even marked the location of the steady drip from the ceiling with a small arrow and the words source. It was a document of irrefutable fact. It was the cavern, translated from wonder into information. It was Thomas's legacy, the habit of mind he had given her, expressed in charcoal and canvas. Sterling knelt down, his initial hostility forgotten, replaced by a deep, grudging curiosity. He studied the map, his finger tracing the line she had drawn. He looked from the canvas to the crack in the rock, and back again. He was a man of the physical world, of fences and property lines, of things that could be measured and counted. This map spoke his language. This was not witchcraft. This was not a miracle. This was geology. "You drew this?" he asked, his voice softer now, stripped of its hard edge. "I did," Anna said. "Thomas taught me how to map a claim. He said to always put things down on paper. He said paper holds still when people's minds are running." Sterling looked up at her. The suspicion in his eyes was gone, replaced by something else. It was a look of profound recalculation. He was re-evaluating everything he thought he knew about this quiet, self-possessed woman. He had come here expecting to unearth a deception. Instead, he had been handed a truth more astonishing than any lie he could have imagined. He stood up, brushing the dust from his knees. He looked at the map, then at her. "I have to see it," he said. It was not a demand. It was a request. Anna hesitated for only a moment. This was the final step, the one that would either secure her world or shatter it. She looked at Sterling, at the genuine awe that had replaced his suspicion, and made her choice. She would trust the truth of the place itself. "The passage is narrow," she said simply. "You'll have to go sideways." She lit the lantern, its familiar scent of oil filling the air. She handed it to him. "I'll follow behind you." "Scout stays here," the dog whined but lay down, his eyes tracking their every move. Sterling took the lantern and, after a moment's hesitation, turned and slid his large frame into the fissure. She heard him grunt with the effort, the sound of his jacket scraping against the stone. She followed, the darkness closing in around her. In the narrow passage, their roles were reversed. He was the one who was uncertain, his movements clumsy in the unfamiliar dark. She was the one who was at home, her feet sure, her body accustomed to the tight confines. "Keep going," she said from behind him. "It opens up in another 10 feet." When he reached the end of the passage and stepped out onto the ledge, he made a low sound in his throat. He held the lantern high, his face illuminated in its glow, his eyes wide. He was speechless. He swept the light across the vast, still pool, across the glittering walls, up into the immense, dark ceiling from which the single drop of water fell, a slow, eternal heartbeat. He walked to the edge and peered down into the black water, just as she had. He touched the wall, his rough fingers tracing the veins of glowing minerals. He was not just seeing a cave. He was seeing the source. He was seeing the answer to the puzzle that had vexed him for months. He was seeing her strength, her labor, her impossible secret. He turned to look at her, his expression one of pure, unadulterated respect. "All this time," he said, his voice a quiet murmur that was swallowed by the cavern silence. "You brought the water out." "By the bucket, yes," she said. He shook his head slowly, a gesture of disbelief and admiration. He understood now. He understood the green garden, the full barrels, the quiet confidence in her eyes. It was not a trick. It was work. Harder work than he could have imagined. He had come to expose a cheat and had found a titan. He stood there for a long time, just looking, taking it all in. When he finally spoke again, his voice was different, settled. "No one else knows," he said. It wasn't a question. "No one else will," she replied. It was a statement of fact, an agreement forged in the cool, silent heart of the mountain. A year passed. The seasons turned, bringing a wet spring and a mild summer. The secret held. Sterling kept his word. He never spoke of what he had seen. But a subtle change occurred in their interactions. He would still ride his fence line, but now, if he saw her, he would raise a hand in a slow, deliberate greeting. A greeting of respect between equals. Sometimes, he would leave a small sack of flour or a haunch of venison on her porch, never waiting for thanks, a silent acknowledgement of the new balance between them. Anna's life settled into a new rhythm, one of quiet abundance. Her garden flourished, providing more than enough for her to eat and to preserve. She traded her surplus tomatoes and squash at the distant settlement, not for necessities, but for small comforts, a new spool of thread, a bag of coffee, a book of poetry. The cavern remained her sanctuary, but it was no longer a source of anxiety. The fear of discovery had been replaced by a sense of deep and abiding security. She made improvements, building a sturdy set of shelves on the ledge to hold her jars, and a small, dry platform near the entrance for storing firewood. The work was no longer frantic or furtive. It was a calm, purposeful tending of her domain. She spent more time there, especially in winter, reading by the light of her lantern, the silence broken only by the chime of dripping water. The place had become intertwined with her identity. It was her wellspring, her pantry, her fortress. It was the physical manifestation of her own resilience. She had not just found it, she had earned it. She had measured it, mapped it, and defended it not with force, but with the quiet authority of truth. It had taught her that the greatest strength was not in what you could fight, but in what you could cultivate in secret. In the quiet heart of the mountain, she had found a way to make the world bend to her, not the other way around. The final scene returns to the beginning, but everything has changed. She is standing at the entrance to the fissure, Scout at her side. It is late afternoon, and the air is cool. She is not checking a fence line. She is not driven by duty or necessity. She is simply pausing at the threshold of her two worlds. She places a hand on the rock, feeling its familiar coolness. The air that breathes from the opening is the same, but it no longer feels like a mystery. It feels like home. She looks out at the vast prairie, at the endless sky, and feels no fear, no loneliness. Her life is no longer a fragile thing, a daily struggle against scarcity. It is rooted, deep and secure as the mountain itself. She has enough. The water, the food, the peace, the solitude. It is enough. She looks down at Scout, who looks back up at her, his amber eyes full of a calm, shared understanding. She gives his head a soft scratch. "Come on, boy," she says quietly. "Let's go in," and together they disappear into the shadow, leaving the wide, empty world behind.